Thank you so much, Amay, for that wonderful introduction. Good, good afternoon, respected sir, respected ma'am, friends. My name is Vikramaditya Jha, and I am a first-year student of BA Honours History. Today, as part of Hidden in Plain Sight, I shall be uh, reading my paper and providing a presentation on Sukumar Sen, who was India's first Chief Election Commissioner. I'm presenting my screen now. The linchpin of India's democracy, Sukumar Sen. On 15th August 2022, India shall complete 75 years of independence, an occasion celebrated nationwide as Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. But this brings us to the question, where have we come after 75 years of our independence? The glorious history of our nation, marked by sacrifices, stupendous achievements, and the throbbing patriotism in the hearts of all who laid down their lives to free India and protect her, as well as those who dedicated their lives for her betterment, has come to a culmination in India's present form. In the words of Jawaharlal Nehru, long years ago we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. As of today, we can say, beyond a shadow of doubt, that India has substantially redeemed its pledge, and it stands on an ornate pedestal in front of the global community. Now that we have been reminded of our nation's achievements, I would like to throw some light on an event which kick-started our democracy, an event which has received far less focus than it should get, India's first general election. I would specifically like to focus on the one individual who made it possible, on whose shoulders stood the responsibility of initiating India into the fold of the world's democracies, Sukumar Sen, India's first Chief Election Commissioner, pictured here as observing a ballot box on the left. Now let us understand who was this charismatic individual. Sukumar Sen, born in 1899, was a brilliant student and academic. He studied at Kolkata's Presidency College before moving to the University of London. At the university, he received a gold medal for mathematics. Sen joined the Indian Civil Services at the age of 22, and by 1947, he had climbed to the senior-most rank an officer could achieve in the British Raj, that of Chief Secretary in West Bengal. Before taking on his duties, he had also served briefly as a judge. The first elections of 1952 under Sen were pivotal because they set the standard for all subsequent elections. There was no staff to help him, no training facilities or infrastructure, and a large part of the staff which had conducted the 1945 assembly elections had either migrated or were killed in riots at the time of partition. Sukumar Sen had to start from scratch. I would now like to throw some light on the problems being faced by a newly formed nation and the overarching context in which Sen had to assume his duties. The first general elections of our nation took place from October 25, 1951 to February 21, 1952, but the backdrop of this election had many political considerations, which resulted in the elections becoming a highly strategic process. Where India became independent in 1947, it continued to be a dominion. There was a British Governor General at the head of the Indian political system, whose authority was greater than that of the Prime Minister, as the Constitution had come into effect on the 26th of January 1950. Prime Minister Nehru was anxious about getting elections underway as soon as possible. Democracy, self-government, and the establishment of the will of the people were the main premises on which the struggle for independence was waged, and without the elections, this premise would remain unfulfilled. Apart from the strain of initiating polls as soon as he could, Sen also had the problem of dealing with citizens who were mostly illiterate. It is estimated that 84% of the total population was illiterate, and key documents for identification were missing, as most people had lost them in the wake of partition. The international situation at the time of the election was also an interesting one. In late 1951, as India was heading to polls, Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan of Pakistan had just been assassinated, and Pakistan fell into the first of its many military dictatorships. The South African government had disenfranchised the Cape Coloured people, who were the last non-white community to have voting rights. The Prime Minister of Iran had also been assassinated, and Vietnam was at war against their French colonists. In this environment of violence and instability, India was faced with the task of upholding the democratic values it had fought for. The problems faced by the new chief hardly seemed to end there. While international issues added to Sen's concerns, the problems at the domestic front were much more difficult to surmount. One of the biggest challenges faced by the Election Commission at the time of the preparation of the electoral rolls was that a large number of women voters had not enrolled by their own names, but by, I quote, description of the relationships they bore to male relations. This was because they were averse to disclosing their proper name to strangers. This response was mainly because of local customs in many North and Central Indian states. These women had no individual identities outside of their association with male family members, and had always been referred to as someone's mother or as someone's wife. Cartoonist Shankar Pillai has also expressed his thoughts regarding the challenges faced by Sen in his Shankar's Weekly. I quote, where nearly 200 million people, for the most part unlettered, but politically conscious nonetheless, are set on choosing between one phenomenally big party and a clutter of many small and new ones, where words have come to be replaced by symbols, where a corps of workers, recruited ad hoc from 1,000 offices with no experience of applied democracy, have to face an army of agents, both suspicious and persistent. The actual process of the elections can be very varying. Unquote. The election was also aimed at ensuring that the universal adult franchise was upheld. During the colonial period, the elections of 1937 and 1945 were held on a restrictive franchise on the grounds of qualifications based on property, taxes paid, among others. The Indian National Congress had made it clear in 1928 during the freedom struggle that the ultimate goal for the country's democratic system would be the universal adult franchise. A committee headed by Motilal Nehru, which had formulated the principles of a constitution, had recommended its adoption. There were two main arguments against the universal adult franchise. The first one corresponded to the massive illiteracy and argued that the election would be rendered a farce unless a system was devised for even the illiterate voter to cast one's vote intelligently and discreetly, with no chances of mishap or error. The other related to the geographical vastness and magnitude of the task that conducting elections would be. It was also argued that the voters under the suffrage would exceed all numerical limits, and it would prove an enormous numerical task for India's government. Now that we are aware of the problems, let us look at the solutions Sen had to come up with. As Chief Election Commissioner, Sukumar Sen had to come up with the most ingenious solutions to tackle the problems discussed, and showed exemplary administrative skill. To compensate for all lost documentation in the post-partition situation, it was decided that any Indian citizen aged 21 years or more who resided in a constituency for more than 180 days would be eligible to vote from that constituency. Of the 489 parliamentary constituencies, 314 were single-seat constituencies. 172 were double-seat constituencies, including one general category and one SC/ST category candidate, and 3 were triple-seat constituencies, which involved one candidate from each category. Transport was arranged by all means possible. Given the geographical vastness of the nation, it was essential to reach even the remotest parts of the nation for collection of votes. Even camels and elephants were used for the same. Attention was also paid to weather conditions. In tehsils like Chini, in present-day Himachal Pradesh, the locals had to cast their vote before the rest of the nation, as snow setting in later would make the passes leading to the village impossible. To resolve the problem of women voters withholding their names, the Election Commission instructed that the name of a voter is essential for identifying a voter. I quote, no election should be no elector should be enrolled unless sufficient particulars, including the name, were given. Unquote. Sen wrote in his official account of the general elections in 1955. To ensure a greater turnout from women voters, public appeals were issued and a 1 month extension was granted in Bihar for filling up of applications for the same. This was done to minimize the number of women voters whose name would be struck off the rolls. A similar extension was also provided in Rajasthan, but the response was poor. I quote, out of a total of nearly 80 million women voters in the country, nearly 2.8 million eventually failed to disclose their proper names, and the entries relating to them had to be struck from the tally, Sen wrote. In spite of the setbacks, by providing women a sense of individual identity, the Election Commission inadvertently took a step towards empowering women in India. Today's awareness, more than 3,000 theatres in the country played a documentary on the universal adult franchise, its functions and the duties of the electorate. The Election Commission and the team of ICS officers under Sukumar Sen also undertook the mammoth task of approaching every adult in India to register their name and convince them to vote in the elections. The officers here were not disconnected from the entire process. They had to get down, they had to reach the people, and they had to do it themselves. They had no help. They had no assistance. This is the basis. These are the giants on whose shoulders our democracy stands today. The unknown ICS officers and the very little known Sukumar Sen. Sen dealt with the problem of illiteracy by making the process of casting votes very simple. He had devised a system where each of the 14 participating national parties would be identified visually by an image, and the image being of an everyday object such as a hand, a tree, or a pair of oxen. Instantly, all voters could identify their party and cast their vote without the need for literacy. The process of voting consisted of putting the ballot paper in any one of the ballot boxes present in the voting booth. Each box bore the symbol of a national party, and thus there were 14 ballot boxes in every booth. Indian scientists also developed indelible ink, which would stay on the voter's finger for about 7 days, as a mechanism to prevent the electoral malpractice of a single individual casting multiple votes. These processes are very important because if we notice, they have carried on into present day. Even today, indelible ink is applied on the index finger of every voter who casts their vote. And despite the introduction of EVMs and VVPATs, we still identify major parties by symbols. So you shall continue finding symbols on the EVMs. This is for the same reason as earlier, to prevent any obstruction caused by lack of literacy. Sukumar Sen also conducted India's second general election in 1957 as Chief Election Commissioner. A report by India Today reveals his foresight. I quote, the second election in 1957 cost India 45 million rupees less because the prudent Sen had safely stored 3.5 million ballot boxes used the first time around, the report stated. He even expressed his views in favor of the universal adult franchise, and the success of the great experiment was enough to silence all opposition. The universal adult franchise was, I quote, an act of faith in the common man of India and his practical common sense. This decision launched a great and fateful experiment, unique in the world for its stupendousness and its complexities, Sukumar Sen wrote in his report. I shall now proceed to play a video released by the Election Commission on the Great Experiment. The Great Experiment was another name given to the first election because nothing of such magnitude had ever taken place earlier.
Though the elected leaders of a free nation enjoy the confidence of their people, it is the people themselves, unknown and unsung, who weave and wear the fabric of democracy. What follows here is the record of such a people, the people of our nation who played a worthy, active part in a great experiment, the experiment of free India's first general election. The aims and ideals that became reality on our attaining independence were well expressed through the adult franchise clause incorporated in our Constitution. Universal adult franchise, a phrase that became a fact, a phrase which conferred on nearly half our total population the right to vote, the right to frame the form of government most suited to our needs. For a nation that had emerged so recently from foreign rule, it was a big step, a bold step forward. For a nation whose illiterates formed the vast majority, it was a course of action in keeping with the size of our subcontinent. The first phase in the great experiment was to enumerate the lists of eligible voters to fashion the electoral rolls for the entire country. This was a task of the greatest magnitude, for over 175 billion names had to be compiled and entered. The next course was the delimitation of a colossal number of constituencies, spread far and wide. The total comprised 2,438 single-member and 666 multiple-member constituencies. With the spade work begun on our franchise, laws and regulations concerning every aspect of electoral procedure had to be drafted, had to be passed by Parliament. These included modification of electoral rolls, qualifications of candidates, campaign expenses, election offences. It was now time to gain the confidence of the electorate itself concerning the great experiment. Every medium of publicity was utilized to orientate the voter. Democracy was on trial, and our many millions were the jury. Since there is no better way of learning than by doing, a series of mock elections were arranged. These mock elections, held at various centers, acquainted our people with the mechanics of voting. Symbols sidestepped many a difficulty, making it easy for an illiterate to spot his favorite candidate. The rehearsals became a boon for officials on election technique, guarding against any slip-ups. This official training made for safe and fair conduct of the elections. Polling programs were made flexible, adapted to meet the demands of agriculture or climatic changes. Lastly, the ballot box, sacred symbol of democracy. 10 million rupees were spent in constructing 2,299,478 ballot boxes. If placed end to end, they would reach for 327 miles. With the party symbols allotted, the stage was set for the great experiment. Into the arena they stepped candidates of every shade of political opinion. Over 20,000 in number, some were independent, others the nominees of different parties. Each was determined to contest the elections with all his ability. Political fever ran high. Campaigners used every media to sway the voter and win his vote. Electioneering took precedence over all other events. Candidates, through personal contacts with the public, explained what they and their parties stood for and had to offer. Well-known leaders made extensive tours, gaining personal knowledge of the political pulse of our people. Mr. Nehru, as president of the Congress Party, made a lightning tour of the land. In a period of 7 weeks, he addressed innumerable meetings to a total audience that could be safely reckoned in millions. He campaigned as Congress President, but as Prime Minister, he exhorted our countrymen to exercise their franchise. He said, "It does not matter for whom you vote, but vote." Equally vehement were the other party leaders and candidates. Jayaprakash Narayan, outstanding figure of the Socialist Party. Leaders of the Krishak Mazdoor Praja Party, Sucheta and Acharya Kriplani, and G. Prakasam. Dr. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, the Jansan, and communist leaders, Miraskar and Gopal Rao. Political views of every size and shade were seen, developing the giant design of democracy. And then on the 25th October 1951, the great experiment unfolded. Among the first of our 175 million men and women to go to the polls were the hardy hill folk of the northern district of Himachal Pradesh. Next came Travancore, Cochin, followed by Hyderabad, Etsu, Madhya Pradesh, the Punjab, Bombay, Madras, and so on. Such scenes were an oft-repeated theme throughout the nation. Each citizen over 21 had the right to cast his vote. Each citizen, man or woman, young or old, in sickness or in strength, countryman or city dweller, weaving thread by thread the fabric of democracy. Some came on foot, some by conveyance, some too feeble or infirm, were helped to achieve their fundamental right, the right to exercise their vote. Nearly 106 billion votes were cast, which meant a poll of 60% for the House of the People alone. The largest democratic elections in world history were an unparalleled success. They went their way efficiently and peacefully, thanks to adequate precautions, to the efforts of the officials, but most of all, because of the wisdom and action of all of those who voted. These votes have chosen the 489 members of the House of the People, and some 3,300 members of the 27 state assemblies. Democracy in action, proving the faith that the founders of our Constitution had in us. Such a success astonished the world. Observers from other lands were impressed by what they saw, the faith and orderliness with which our citizens cast their votes. Foreign delegations were generous in their praise of how the great experiment had been conducted and undertaken. Even our simplest citizens had displayed their inherent love of freedom's way of life. Covering more than 3 months, the elections were finally over. We had chosen our leaders in the best of democratic traditions. In conclusion, the chief credit for this noble undertaking goes to our people, whose multi-million voices have always the ready answer to what's good and bad in government. We are as yet too near the scheme of things to judge the lasting results of this great experiment. That is best left to posterity. But if posterity were to judge whether the part our people played in the great experiment has been fitting and worthwhile, it can be acclaimed in a single word. And that word is yes. Jai Hind.
Sukumar Sen was the organizer of this mammoth task and worked with silence and efficiency. But that brings us to the final question. What was his legacy? It is easy to answer this question. Sukumar Sen can safely be called the establisher of the electoral system of independent India. In its first election itself, India saw 55 registered political parties, including 14 national parties competing for 489 seats in the lower house of parliament. Established democracies in the West, such as the UK and the United States, have no more than 2 or 3 political parties till date. India, also since the very beginning, gave voting rights to women. The ballot papers were printed at the Government Security Press at Nashik. Around 30,000 polling stations were reserved exclusively for women. The total turnout was 45.7%, which was not bad under the prevailing circumstances. In the Kottayam district of Kerala, the voter turnout was as much as 80.5%. which only goes to show the enthusiasm of Indian voters to exercise their franchise. The first election also drew huge interest abroad. Several countries, including Nepal, Indonesia, and sent their official teams to witness the great experiment. Sudan, which went to polls in 1953, sought Saint's services to conduct its general elections on the basis of universal adult franchise. I'd like to quote Sri Pranab Mukherjee, our ex-president, in the first Sukumar Sen Memorial Lecture of 2020. He was chosen to play obstetrician and to deliver Indian democracy's first crop of nearly 3,000 elected representatives. Realizing with surprising un-ICS humility that democracy likes its mechanics to be as self-effacing as possible, the Chief Election Commissioner became an unseen, undogmatic influence, patiently judicial in his attitude to parties but insistent in regard to the machine he wielded. This is a memorial stamp issued for the same, the Sukumar Sen Memorial Lecture Series, which can be accepted that the great experiment and every election that has followed is Sukumar Sen's legacy. Thank you. Jai Hind.
That was very, very nice, Vikramaditya. I really enjoyed it. And to be honest, never knew so much about this, about Sukumar Sen. So, first of all, thank you for introducing us to him. That was the whole idea of the series, that we come to know of contribution of various people, and it should evoke that sense of involvement and pride and being part of this nation. And I think your presentation was able to do that, that one could feel that, here is the contribution of a man we hardly know about, but then and today, how we have flourished as a democracy. So thank you so much for working on it. Now, are there any questions or any comments, or anybody wants to say something? Please go ahead. Saurabh?
I do have some questions.
Yeah, please do.
Thing is, it's usually the normative behavior of the West was to restrict the enfranchisement was because it was seen that literacy played a heavy role in political consciousness. So when the great experiment, as even Ramachandra Guha calls about, it was to show that literacy has to do a lot with political consciousness. Even illiteracy had its sway in political consciousness. So to what extent would you say that how illiteracy in India led to a political consciousness and a consciousness among the people? The voting right is something which is a act of going to a ballot and voting, but my question would be, to what extent would you assess that the people who voted know what they voted for, who they voted for, and what was its significance?
I would like to answer you. Your point was that how political consciousness does not necessarily relating to literacy or illiteracy, and how the illiterate understood what they have voted for. Did I catch this part correctly?
Yes.
In India, we must also observe the parameters we use to measure literacy. And a lot of times, the people who seem disconnected from political mechanism, who seem not to know what an election is, or who seem to only know of the government as Sarkar, they do not see it as somebody amongst themselves. They see it as a higher authority, as somebody who holds sway over their lives, who makes their decisions for them. But that means that even the illiterate, one who does not know how to write or how to read, can still understand what is happening in the nation, He knows what the Sarkar is. He knows what the Sarkar does. But he doesn't know how to control the Sarkar. He doesn't know his rights. He doesn't know his abilities. He doesn't know the power of the vote. That is why we see that literacy a lot of times can be used to manipulate the public, not only to educate the public. In early times, in times of early independence, the English speaking individual was seen as something you should be frightened of, and literacy was in general seen as something people would avoid, that these are books, they are things that are apart from us. But even then they observed. You cannot take the ability of an individual to observe his surroundings, to observe the political environment away, especially because an ordinary average citizen knows a lot about what happens in his everyday lives, in the area around him. National politics is based on district politics. It is only when you see change around you, and not change promised to the nation, but change around you, that you may know that your vote matters. So I feel that even though the masses were illiterate, through the freedom struggle, through our leaders, through our various leaders who were not necessarily restricted to Congress, like Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, they all saw examples of how they could unite. They saw examples of how they could bring change. So literacy should not act as a restraint. That is why it was not treated as a primary criterion, and that is why it should not be treated as a basic requirement. I would also like to draw attention to the example of panchayats. In panchayats in India, it is very difficult to know who is literate, because we define literacy as the ability to read and write in a particular language with understanding. But there we may not be certain who can read or who can write. But even then, since the times of yore, our villages have been practicing local self-government without the need for literacy. So that only reinforces the fact that political consciousness only needs the power to observe and interpret, and not necessarily the ability to read or write.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else?
Thank you, Vikram, for your presentation, and thank you for educating us about how we kick-started this process of democracy in India. Though I've seen the presentation earlier, but every time I look at it, while you were presenting, each word was actually seemed quite. It was actually a mammoth task. It was a great experiment. The world was looking at it. One interesting thing, which I, while you were talking about it, I thought was that, how elections can be seen, if one is looking at the process of gender or, gender relations or gender identity, how even through the lens of elections, one can see where the women were when we had just got independence, and how difficult, as you pointed out, was a task to get women to disclose their identity. The fact that these the issues like this are almost unknown to us in our present times, like it is something unheard of in the present times. That in itself is a remarkable achievement. And to go back to what Saurav asked, and what you did, I think we also need to give credit to the very long national movement that we had, especially the mass movements of Gandhi, because they were mass movement in the truest sense, and people from all walks of life, they joined the movement irrespective of the fact whether they were educated, not educated, tribals, non-tribals, workers. People actually from different strata of our society joined those movements, and they realized in that process that they do have some sort of power, you know, uh, to even if it is to get independence. And once you see that those events become successful, the Indian voters were, in that sense, it did must have felt, empowered. Also the fact that, you know, your presentation did mention that, you know, the we did have one of the biggest challenges, or, you know, the problems which is stated especially by the left, is that you know, Congress was the biggest party and it was so obvious for the Congress to win the elections. But I think the, even if it was that obvious, you know, the people from the Indian National Congress did go out and did try to educate the voters and get them to come out and vote, you know, as what at one point of time in your presentation where it said that it doesn't matter who you vote for, but at least go and vote. So if Congress knew it was winning, Congress should have sat back, you know, and enjoyed the process, you know, let it take over, and, you know, we are going to win in any case. But it was actually to get the process started, you know, that was the first thing, first experiment, you know. And I think we must give enough credit to these leaders across parties, as, you know, Jayaprakash Narayan, Shama Prasad Mukherjee, you know, Jawaharlal Nehru, who were instrumental in making India the nation where we stand today at the 75th year of our independence. So, with that, I want to congratulate you and thank you for, you know, for such a presentation which educated me, especially, you know, because I had absolutely no idea about a number of things which you mentioned in your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you
So
so much, ma'am.
rightly
Thank you,
pointed
friends, for your
out,
patience.
Ishan, you know, that it, you know, it was a mammoth task, and I feel we should understand the importance of it, you know, and especially in today's scenario, we should not let things slip by, you know,
Absolutely.
because of
Because,
the effort that has gone into, making what the Indian democracy is today, you know. So that's it, you know. So I think more and more people need to reflect on this, you know, and the building blocks, the effort that has gone into it. So we should not take a lot of things for granted.
yeah.
That also kind of becomes extremely important in this context. You know.
I
Sort
mean,
of.
thousands of invisible Sukumar Sens who would have been responsible, you know,
Yeah,
uh,
absolutely.
to conduct those elections and make us reach here where we take things for granted, as
Yeah.
mom said.
And
Yeah.
and fact that they had, you know, what were the infrastructure that was available, and the kind of work that needed to be done.
Yes.
Take that kind of challenge, definitely. Saurabh, Mayur, Yash, anybody else would like to say something? Yeah, go ahead, Amit.